So here's what's going on. We have an economy that's already slow, and then on top of that, we have inflation that's surging to some of the highest levels that we've seen in decades, and now it's harder for people to go out and afford things because everything is so expensive. And now the Federal Reserve Bank and the government have each proposed a solution to this raging inflation problem. First, the Fed says that we need to keep interest rates low. The New York Times published an article talking about this, where Jerome Powell has come out and said that inflation is becoming a real issue, and because inflation is such a big issue, we cannot raise interest rates. We need to leave interest rates low. This is an interesting solution because low interest rates cause more inflation, but we'll get more on that in just a little bit. And the government also has their own solution. So the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, went out in a recent interview and she said that inflation is not that bad. She says that we have a good grasp on inflation and it's not out of control, and that we have a good handle on inflation. Then she came out and said that although inflation is high, we still got a grasp on it, but we do have a solution for this inflation. And that solution, according to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, is to increase government spending. What she says is that the government needs to pass 2 new spending bills, which add up to just under $3 trillion. And if the government spends this $3 trillion, that will lower inflation. Again, a very interesting proposal, because the big reason why we're seeing all the inflation that we're seeing now is because the government has been spending money they don't have, and when they have to print the money to cover these extra costs, that causes inflation. But Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says if we increase spending more, she wants to pass a $1 trillion infrastructure package and a $1.8 trillion climate and social package. And she says that if we spend this additional $2.8 trillion, this will bring inflation down. So let's dive into both of these, because both of these two things in general would cause more inflation, but the Fed and the government think that they're going to actually bring inflation down. Let me start by talking about interest rates. I'll talk about what this does, and then I'll talk about what the Fed's goal is. So when interest rates are lower, people and businesses are more likely to go out and borrow money, because now mortgage rates are lower and credit card rates are lower, so people are more likely to go out and borrow money from the bank. It's the same with corporations. If you can go out and borrow money at 3% or 4%, and then you can invest this new money back into your business, and you can grow your company by 6% a year, well, now it'll be profitable for you to go out and borrow money. Or what you're also seeing happen is you're seeing a lot of corporations go out and borrow money at 3% or 4%, and then they're using all of their extra dollars to buy back their own stock, which boosts their stock price. And if they can boost their stock price by more than 3 or 4%, well, now they're profitable. The reason why these type of lower interest rates create more inflation is because when you go to the bank and you borrow $100,000, well, the bank has to get this money from somewhere. And a lot of times what they'll do is they will borrow this money from the Federal Reserve Bank, and then they will lend it out to you. So this money has to be created essentially out of thin air, and it gets lent out, because the way that the banking system works is it is a fractional reserve lending system, which means if you go and deposit $10,000 into your bank account, the bank is not just going to sit on those $10,000. They're going to take the $10,000, put a little bit of money and put it aside, and they're going to lend out the other $9,000. Then somebody else is going to borrow that $9,000 and they're going to deposit it into their bank account. Then the other bank is going to take that $9,000, put a little bit aside into their vault, and they're going to lend out the other $8,100. And this goes on and on and on. So the initial $10,000 of money that you deposited now gets multiplied again and again and again because of the banking system, because you deposited one time, and now the bank is going to lend it out again and again and again. And if the bank doesn't have enough cash to lend out, they don't want to be out of business. So what do? They go to the Federal Reserve Bank, they borrow more money from the Federal Reserve Bank, the Fed creates this money out of thin air, they give it to the bank, and then the bank gives this money to you. So when interest rates are low, you are seeing more dollars enter our economic system or economic circulation, because people are able to go out and borrow money. They're more likely to go out and borrow money, and you're seeing the same thing happen with businesses and corporations. So more businesses, more people go out and borrow money, more money gets created, more dollars enter our economic circulation, and this creates more inflation. And so inflation is when the supply of dollars go up, causing the value of each dollar to go down. That's why a dollar today is not as valuable as a dollar was 20 years ago, or a dollar was 50 years ago. A dollar 50 years ago had way more buying power than it did today because of inflation. We have seen way more money printing happen over the last 50 years, causing the value of each individual dollar to go down. And so now, if you save $10,000 in the bank, that $10,000 that you put in the bank today is not going to grow, because we are in a low interest rate environment, which means you can get a mortgage at a low rate, but that also means that your bank is not going to pay you any interest. If you put your $10,000 in the bank, you're going to see your $10,000 stay $10,000 for years. And so you put $10,000 in the bank today, in 10 years, your $10,000 is going to grow to $10,000 and a few pennies, maybe a few other dollars. So now you have essentially $10,000 in the bank, but the cost of things are not going to stay the same in 10 years. The price of everything around you is going to be way more expensive, but that $10,000 cannot stretch as far. That's what inflation is. And the reason why you see that happen is when you increase the money supply. When you increase the dollar supply, the value of each individual dollar goes down. And so when you have low interest rates, more dollars enter our economic circulation, which causes more inflation. So at this point, you might be wondering, why the heck does the Federal Reserve Bank want to keep interest rates low to help fight inflation? Great question. Well, it's because we are in an economic environment where our economy is not growing fast enough and our economy is so reliant on these low interest rates. So if the Fed starts to increase interest rates, which would slow down inflation, they're worried that this will slow down the economy, which is not good for the stock market, which is not good for the economy. See, this is where things start to become really dicey and really tricky because we're supposed to be in a free market. And in a free market, you see booms and busts. That's part of the economic cycle. And those busts are where the economic system refreshes. It's where the bad assets and the bad money leaves, and then the new money can come in, and that can refresh the economic system. But the Federal Reserve Bank has been trying to almost desensitize us from risk. Like when we saw the 2020 crash happen, we were in the worst recession since the Great Depression, but our stock market crash only lasted 2 months. Why? Because the Federal Reserve Bank opened up the money printer and we saw a flood of money enter our economy. We saw a flood of money enter the markets, and this propped up the stock market. And now what was the most drastic and most dramatic stock market crash in history became one of the fastest stock market booms in history. The Fed does not want to see the economy slow down. That's why they're so scared to raise interest rates, and the price that people pay for that is through inflation. Now, inflation is known as a hidden tax because the person who pays the price for inflation is the person who doesn't understand what inflation is. That's why it's known as a hidden tax. It's a tax on the average person because now when the average person living off of a fixed salary, you have a set paycheck that you're getting every 2 weeks. You take this paycheck and you go shopping, you go buy your groceries. Now your paycheck doesn't stretch as far. So the person who pays the price for all of this low interest rates is the average person who doesn't understand what's going on. While the financially educated, wealthy get rich off of this because now all the money keeps flowing back to the top. Because when you're in a high inflationary environment, asset prices go up. And who owns assets? Well, the rich and the wealthy. So the rich now get wealthier while the poor and the middle class are getting poorer and poorer because now their dollars don't stretch as far. The last time we saw an economic environment like this was back in the 1970s. It was an era of stagflation, which meant we saw slowing economic growth with rising inflation. Kind of like what we're seeing now. Now, the government and the Federal Reserve Bank keep saying that we are not in a stagflationary environment right now. I'll explain why in just a second. But they keep saying that we are not in stagflation right now. We're not seeing what we saw happen in the 1970s. But in the 1970s, we saw massive amounts of inflation. Part of the reason for that was because in 1971, the United States took the dollar off of the gold standard. So the United States government was able to work with the Fed to print an unlimited amount of money. So we saw very high amounts of inflation in the 1970s while the economy was not growing and while wages were not growing. So now the question is, how did they solve that problem in the 1970s? Well, it was by raising interest rates in the 1980s. Inflation was getting so out of control in the 1970s because of all the government spending and because of all the money printing and because of all the dollars entering our economy from lending. The government and the Fed had to work to now really try to cool it down in the 1980s. And the way they did that was by ramping up interest rates. In the 1980s, if you wanted to go out and buy a home, you could be paying up to 18.5% a year on your mortgage. 18.5% a year. The reason why interest rates had to go up so much was because that was the only way that the government and the Fed could slow down the inflation that we were seeing. Now, the inflation levels that we're seeing today is not too far off from what we saw back in the 1970s, and the worry is that inflation gets out of control again in this decade, that we're going to have to ramp up interest rates to crazy levels like we saw happen back in the 1980s to cool down inflation again. But the government and the Fed say that we are in a very different environment. We are not in a stagflationary environment like we were in the 1970s. According to the government and according to the Federal Reserve Bank, the reason why inflation is not something we have to worry about right now is because of the cause of inflation. According to them, the reason why we're seeing so much inflation is not because we have a lot of dollars entering our economic circulation. The reason why we're seeing so much inflation is because of the supply chain bottlenecks in our economy. Because it's so hard to get supplies and products into the ports from California, because it's so hard to get products from overseas into the United States, it is very hard for companies to be able to sell their products. And because of that, companies are having to raise the price of the products. The reason, according to the government and the Fed, the reason why we're seeing such high inflation right now has nothing to do do with all the excess dollars, but has everything to do with the supply chain issues. Now, I don't disagree. I think we have a lot of supply chain issues, which is leading to the price of some things going up. But what's happening is you have the government and the Fed completely ignoring this side of inflation because they're saying that the only reason why we're seeing inflation is because of supply chain issues, and these supply chain issues are just completely like blocking the idea that money printing could cause more inflation. So the supply chain issues are right now overpowering the idea that money printing could cause more inflation because it's creating a smoke screen. Right now, all they're saying is a supply chain issue because all this money printing is inflation that's behind the smoke screen, which they can't see right now. The worry is what happens if all these supply chain issues go away, but we still have this high inflation. Then what? Now, if you want my personal opinion, now I know I'm just a random guy on YouTube, I do think that these supply chain issues are causing massive pressure on prices of products. And so when these supply chain issues go away, I do think that we're going to see the prices of things go down because I think that we're going to see a lot of companies over order their products, which is going to cause an excess supply, maybe even a glut in products, which will cause the price of things to go down. But that's when we're going to start to feel the effects of all this money printing, because you cannot ignore the idea that money printing causes inflation. I mean, that is what causes inflation. When you dilute the value of the dollar, that's what causes the value of the dollar to go down, which causes the price of things to go up. So I think we're going to see a lot of fluctuation in the prices of things, but I don't think we're out of the clear with all this money printing because we have printed an historic amount of money in 2020 and 2021. We printed so much money even when people were not working. So we're printing this money essentially out of thin air based off of what? Because money is supposed to be some sort of representation or store of value. And if our country and people were not producing, but we're still able to produce money, what happens? The value of our dollar has to go down. If you enjoyed this short clip from my longer videos, here's another clip that I think you'll love. And while you're at it, if you're interested in learning more about how to start generating passive income, our team put together an amazing guide that goes over what passive income is, how to start generating passive income, and different passive income strategies. These are things that you can start doing even if you don't have a lot of money. So if you want to read this free guide on how to start generating passive income for free, all you got to do is click that button right over there. Thank you for watching, and as always, keep hustling.